Greetings from Montreal, where this morning, this Sunday, it is a balmy minus 14 degrees with a nice little wind chill factor, bringing it down to a felt temperature of minus 22. No, I'm not here to give you a weather report, but I do like to think of all of you there in Melbourne having a lovely warm February, whereas here in Montreal we're at the depths of its coldness. And there's something about that difference that makes it amusing in some ways, I think, for me to be talking to you from Canada. Why I am doing that, who I am, all of this we will get to shortly. But over the next few weeks, we'll be, well, not exactly chatting, but you'll be sending me some comments over the next weeks about your questions and your thoughts about the course material that you're about to engage in, and I will be responding. So this initial video is a way to set up the course a little bit and introduce a few ideas that Lily has asked me to do, as well as introduce myself, as well as introduce the context in which all of this sits, and again, why am I speaking to you on a video from Canada recorded a week ago? So all will become clear in short time. Well, if I'm sitting here on your screen, you will likely know that my name is David Szanto. I live here in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada, and I am what am I? I am a person who's done many things within the world of food, including teaching and researching about it, and creating art and writing about it, including cooking it, and fermenting it, and baking it. I've done a lot of different things in food. So before I start to tell you some of my ideas about why I think politics and gastronomy are such a delicious mix, it might be appropriate for me to introduce some of my background so that you at least have a sense of where I am speaking from and how some of my ideas are framed and the experiences that I've had that has started to construct those framings. So I won't give you my complete biography, which, although I may find it fascinating to recount, you might not find it all that interesting to listen through. But I will tell you that over the many years that I have been working in food in different ways, I have worked as a caterer, as a cook, both in restaurants and in domestic contexts. I've also done a fair bit of consulting to some very large multinational corporations, which shall remain nameless. I have worked for some of those guys, and it was very much that experience with large industrial food manufacturers that drove me eventually to then go and study in my first degree in gastronomy, which was the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy. And this was a school founded in 2004 by the Slow Food International movement, and the idea was to create a new generation of gastronomic thinkers through both an undergraduate and a master program to help people think in a more complex 360 or maybe 270 degree perspective on food, because of course, as we know, food studies goes way beyond one discipline or another, and in fact crossing disciplines and blending them and perhaps combining them into a new discipline or a non-discipline might be appropriate in this very complex global reality that we currently live in. So this is why the university was founded, and what started to transform my life from food enthusiast into, I think, what I can now call myself as a food scholar, researcher, artist. And that has opened up my eyes to many different forms and structures within food systems, including those of power, which is why we're here sitting talking today. So I did my master degree there. It led me to become very interested in how food could be, or how perhaps gastronomy could be academized in other places in the world. As far as I knew at that time, it was one of the very few programs in gastronomy. Of course, the Cordon Bleu University of Adelaide program in gastronomy had existed before, but this university seemed to be continuing things and doing things in a somewhat different way, where it was blending both the sensory aspects of food in terms of tasting and smelling and visuality and textures in-class workshops, along with social sciences and humanities, as well as communications technologies, as well as various other kinds of food technology, not getting quite towards food science, but certainly dealing with how the production methods of food produce some of its cultural and sensorial outputs. So this really opened up my eyes, and when I I came back to Montreal. I did continue teaching for that university and doing a lot of different communications and outreach consulting. Eventually, I became a professor there and took on a number of other roles, including program director. But here in Montreal, where I was living and sort of commuting back and forth from, I became interested in doing my own PhD in gastronomy. And that's what I did at Concordia University, which allows for a very wide range of different themes and disciplines and practices to come together. And so in 2015, I completed what I believe is the first PhD in gastronomy, taking the idea of eco-gastronomy as the center of my thesis. That is, a kind of ecological, performative, systemic approach to what food is, and therefore, hopefully, an ecological, performative, systemic approach to how food should be studied. At the time, it was fairly radical. There have been a number of students, including some of my ex-master students, who have come along and started to do similar types of PhDs. And one of the critical elements that's incorporated into this kind of work is what we in Montreal and in Canada call research creation. Research creation is a little bit like performance-led research or practice-led research or material research. So there are a lot of different forms of this. Certainly design and art and various performance studies involve themselves in research creation, because the idea is when you engage with the material aspects of your subject as well as the discursive aspects, some new ways of understanding that subject come into light. In the meantime, I was still working for the University of Gastronomic Sciences, and that's what first brought me to Melbourne, where I first encountered William Angliss. I had known Kelly Gennady before that, and she invited me there for about a month to do some workshops with various members of the faculty, including the wonderful Lily Cleary, and that's where she and I first met. And these workshops were geared around this idea of research creation, or using design and materiality to help understand how food and food systems could be more complexly perceived and then engaged with and intervened upon and perhaps changed, and presumably changed for the better. So with a subject as vast and perhaps ambiguous, but also very important as the politics of gastronomy, the question in many minds, including mine, is where to start. How do you start to chew off everything that is political about food? And maybe the beginning place is the beginning place. So one of the things that I think is most important about politics is the way it comes to have its own kind of life. That is, that when you put together a number of different policies, agreements, and sets of power, that system sometimes starts to do things on its own without necessarily the hand of human beings wielding their explicit powers, and then there's this implicit power that then starts to emerge from that system. And that's very much about food as well. Food is also a complex system of multiple elements that come together, some of them living, some of them not, some of them human, some of them not, some of them physical, and some of them not. So they're concrete and abstract actors within the world of gastronomy. And food systems, as we have noticed, have come to create their own sense of agency or movement or dynamism or liveliness. They seem to sometimes act on their own, producing economic downturns, producing cultural trends, producing a sense of domination, helplessness, empowerment, all sorts of things. And so that's also where politics and let's call it the ecologies of food or gastronomy tend to exhibit similar patterns. And so when politics come together with gastronomy, that's even more complex, and there are even more potentials for things to start behaving in interesting ways that may govern our lives or may have some impact on them, or with which we may want to intervene and wield our own sense of power within those larger systems of movement and matter and meaning. So having had these wonderful encounters at William Angliss and with both Kelly and Lily, they eventually invited me to help write this subject, the politics of gastronomy, using some of my perspectives, some of the writings and readings that I have encountered in my life, and bring them together for your learning pleasure. And so in this very introductory set of videos right now, I wanted to go through some of the reasons for that set of readings, some of the ways that this subject has been constructed and why there's a lot of talk and a lot of reading, but also hopefully some doing and making, which might help you as students come to engage with the subject in a way that you might not otherwise have. And one of the very starting points for me in food and in power, which is of course at the root of politics, is the question of framing systems. And by framing systems, I mean those things that human beings make in order to shape or structure or control or stabilize food. And so from a very basic beginning foundational perspective, one framing system is language. Language is a way that we give structure to meaning, and that's something that we use in order to shape and stabilize meaning. Even as language is often quite dynamic and changes, it also does give this structuring quality that helps us. It's very useful. It allows us to communicate, it allows us to define things, it allows us to shape what we're trying to express. At the same time, language, like any framing system, creates limits. And even the word definition, which is a word I try to avoid as much as possible, but definition, at its etymological root anyway, means to put an end to things. And in dynamic systems, putting an end to things can be a complicated and somewhat troubling position to take, because things, of course, don't end when the system is dynamic. Things keep changing and evolving and moving. And so usefully, language does this as well. But in the short term, language can tend to frame and limit and stabilize that which is very dynamic and lively. And so language is then one useful framing system and one problematic framing system for food. And that's, of course, why in many ways I'm interested in engaging with the materiality of food and the movement of food. Because when you think about those things and you engage with them, it helps perceive language as just one of the framing systems. So what about other framing systems? Well, one good place to start with food is just look around you. What do you have? You have a house, you have a classroom, you have a refrigerator, you have a kitchen. You have a lot of different elements of the built environment which are designed to frame food just as much as language does. And that is to control it. The refrigerator keeps food stable, relatively. Sometimes you discover at the back of your fridge something that has stopped being stable and has continued to live and grow and multiply, and then you tend to throw that piece of food out because you don't want to eat what has multiplied upon it. But a fridge is a stabilization device, as is almost every other technology we employ to make food commercial. Food is inherently lively and dynamic and non-stable. Plants and animals and their fibers and material parts decompose over time. And so a lot of what happens in the food processing world is, again, some sort of framing system, whether it's a framing system of chemistry or physics, a piece of packaging or a dehydration process, all of which help to stabilize food and make it what we call shelf stable. And that is in some ways antithetical to the beginning nature of food. Yes, when we intervene upon it, it becomes more shelf stable. But if we were to leave it alone, what would it do? What would it do on its own? And that's one of the themes that we'll get to in one of the later readings with Jane Bennett particularly, who talks about what happens when non-human things are left to interact and produce transformation on their own. Looking farther afield, many other framing systems can be perceived. The corral is a physical framing system to keep animals in a certain space where they can be presumably manipulated in all the ways that we do during domestication. So control their eating, control their reproduction, control their lifespan and their deaths. And that is one framing system that is very useful. Otherwise, animals might likely run away. Even something like a farm or a raised bed or a garden is a framing system for plants to keep them roughly in one place to allow us to benefit from the fruits of their production. Those are more physical framing systems. But then when we get into questions of regulation and policy and standards, we also encounter more discursive framing systems again, things that come together in what we eventually call politics. And it's interesting to note, I often go to other languages to see if there are any insights that you can draw from different translations of words. And of course, in French and Italian, which are the other two languages I know a bit of, the word for policy is politique or politica. So even there, politics and policy come to be seen as very related. And of course, when you put together a bunch of policies and articulate them together, and then create systems for enforcing them and changing them, you have politics. And politics has multiple meanings. It's what politicians engage in, it's what people in offices engage in, and it's really the exchange and leverage of different kinds of power to achieve different goals that are constructed through different motivations of either individuals or groups of people. So that's one description of what politics is. Of course, there are many others. But I think it's very interesting to note that when you articulate multiple framing systems together, language and policies, and you articulate them together with various physical framing systems out in the world, or processes of framing, particularly food, things like domestication and food stabilization, you get to a very complex system of multiple framing systems articulated together that then have different impacts on each other, that then potentially produce a system that is lively and dynamic and doing something on its own. And that's the politics of gastronomy.